last lap before Bangkok shopping, massage, and other activities. April 18, 2015. That date is the date when a fishing vessel capsized off the coast of Lampedusa and 800 asylum seekers died in the sea. And this is also the date where the Western world woke up to the idea of forced displacement. Before it didn't exist, it was not in the conference, and this is the beginning. And one of the reasons when the conference here exists is because after what happened, the so-called European refugee crisis engendered all the policy mobilization and the resources that led to us today. But if you looked towards Colombia, this is where this issue of forced displacement has been in the academic world for decades. Ana Maria Ibanez was one of the pioneers of research on forced displacement, and I think Andrés, Sandra, and to some extent Maria Jose as well, are the heir of that foresight in terms of research. And so this topic of mental health is one of those topics that Andrés has been starting a while ago before it becomes now one issue, the frontier issue in forced displacement. So do expect to see Andrés giving more keynote speeches, whether it's here, whether it's in Vienna, maybe not San Remo, but whether it's in any other place in the world. I've had the privilege to know Andrés for a while, and I think among the people who inspire you, you have people who inspire you for their research. Some people inspire you for who they are, and some people who inspire you for both. And I think Andrés is part of that very small third category. Not only does he do research, but then he set up an NGO to really put into actions what he learned through the data. Someone said at the beginning, behind data there are people, and I think Andrés really epitomizes that view that beyond the data we need to put this into action. So you've heard enough of me, over to you, Andrés.
Okay, thank you so much, Antoine. Thank you so much for those generous words. And it's great being here. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you to the JDC. Umi, I don't know where she is, kind of in the back, coordinating everything. Our host, Leopold, thank you so much for having us. And it's a really great pleasure. And I think my job is relatively easy right now because I'm going to be building on a lot of the things that everybody has been talking over these 3 days. Deborina, Shelby, Sigrid, Richard. Your words, Tuan, actually made my job a little bit easier when you put the poverty trap figure today. Obviously, Antonia, Sandra, and Murat. And so when Domenico kindly invited me here, he didn't invite me to San Remo, but he invited me here. We started thinking about like maybe not give like a talk on a single paper, but a little bit on this overview of a trajectory of a little bit over 20 years studying displacement in Colombia. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be focusing on mental health as a missing link that can actually explain the persistence or contribute to explaining the persistence of poverty in Colombia. And also talking to Domenico, the idea was, well, let's try to get some of these stories of how we got to this research and where the kind of research ideas came in. And obviously being like inspired by a lot of work and a lot of like academic work, but more importantly, talking to people in the field and getting to sense what they experience and how they see the future. So that's it. So I started in 2004. I was a research assistant for Ana Maria Ibanez. At the time, there were like 40 million people that were displaced in the world, but I think as Tuan rightly mentioned, nobody was paying attention to this. In Colombia, we had 2.2 million IDPs, and kind of like the questions that we started thinking about at that moment were, what are the consequences of displacement? And as we started documenting the persistence of poverty, then the guiding question was, how do we promote these movements out of poverty? How do we promote self-reliance? And so if we flash forward 20 years. Now this is like a global development challenge. We're here. This is a great community that we've been like for 4 years building, sharing our research. There's now 123 million displaced persons. In Colombia, the number of displaced persons actually increased by 4 times, all the way to 8.6 million IDPs. And again, 20 years later, the questions are pretty much the same. So how do we promote self-reliance? How do we promote these sustainable movements out of poverty? And so what I'm going to be doing here is try to connect a little bit at the beginning with the initial slides that Tuan introduced us to about poverty traps. So kind of like a standard perspective on the persistence of poverty, like a standard perspective from the point of view of an economist. But then I'm going to try to bring mental health into question and try to understand, well, mental health is important by itself, but also how can it contribute to the persistence of poverty. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about impacts on beliefs, skills, income trajectories. I'm going to focus a little bit more on early child development, building upon what Sandra just presented. And then I'm going to show some, so kind of the first 2 acts are a little bit depressing. They show one, the persistence of poverty across time, 2, negative impacts in terms of mental health and how they span across different dimensions. But I want to end in like a more positive note in how carefully designed interventions can actually help us break the cycle. So I'm going to talk about how a mental health program that we have developed for caregivers of young children is both promoting mental health, but it's also affecting children's development, and also trying to create hope and agency. So that's kind of the roadmap for what's happening right now, right? And so I'm going to be focusing in Colombia. We started studying this again in 2005, and just kind of complementing a little of the things that Sandra was mentioning, it's proactive conflict since the 1950s. There's currently between 8.6 and 9.1 million IDPs. This represents 11% of the IDPs worldwide. Unfortunately, it's still happening. Just last year, there were more than 250,000 displaced persons in the country, and many more that are actually also confined by different actors. You can see in the map that displacement has actually happened pretty much across the country. There's some pockets in the country that have been more intensely or severely affected, but displacement happens pretty much everywhere, even in cities, Medellin, Bogotá, and so on. And then on top of this, as Sandra was mentioning, since 2016, we became kind of the largest host of Venezuelan refugees. When you bring IDPs and refugees together, it's pretty much 20% of the Colombian population. Now, what's interesting about Colombia is also that there's a very comprehensive set of laws and policy frameworks. Sandra mentioned 2 of them. It actually started 30 years ago. And what's interesting is that these policy frameworks were not informed by evidence, as kind of we try to think that evidence guides policy, but it was actually the other way around. These set of laws were actually established recognizing the massive violation of human rights, and then establishing some commitments for the government to provide humanitarian assistance, to provide some support, to try to prevent displacement, and try to protect the lands, the assets, the rights of IDPs. Over time, this started also moving into thinking about reparations and started moving into movements out of poverty, right? And so at the beginning, I remember I was getting out of grad school, college, when the Constitutional Court enacted this ruling that established that IDPs should be treated with priority over other vulnerable populations. And my professors and policymakers, everybody was kind of thinking, well, this is a little bit insane. Why are lawyers just kind of driving economic policy? In their words, and I remember I kind of got this quote by heart, they were saying, well, IDPs are just poor, so we should just open the bag of anti-poor programs and put the IDPs there, and that's it. And so this started, and this motivated Maria Ibanez to kind of start thinking, what are the socioeconomic consequences of displacement? Are the displaced a little bit different than the chronic poor? And whether this actually then demands a little bit of different types of policies and interventions. all the way until 2011, when we enacted the victims law, kind of in preparation for all the peace process, there was kind of a nice dialogue between evidence and legal perspectives. Now, this then led into very comprehensive set of policies, starting from humanitarian assistance to social protection, education, health, and so on, cash transfers, and then more recently in reparations and indemnities. Very ambitious, also a little bit over-ambitious to some extent. If we take the fiscal law of the victims law, the fiscal cost of the victims law, it's actually 35% of GDP. So pretty much impossible to fulfill. And at the current rate of the people that have been receiving reparations and all these type of policies, it would take us 100 years to get there. So also setting like very, like maybe too optimistic or too ambitious goals. And despite these policy frameworks, despite all these resources, and despite all these programs, poverty persists among the displaced. And so this figure is showing you in the blue lines the evolution of poverty rates for Colombians in general, average Colombians. And then the little red dots are showing you the poverty rates for different surveys that have been nationally representative for IDPs. We actually, with Ana Maria, collected the data for the first one. And at that moment, we were showing that poverty rates were above 80%. Extreme poverty was around 70%. And you start seeing a little bit of a downward trend, especially for 2012 to 2014, when the victims law came in. But if you move forward to 2023, it's super interesting. It was kind of like a thought experiment, like a quasi-experiment, because the government just interrupted the delivery of cash transfers 3 months before the survey. And then as you see, kind of poverty rate increase all the way to above 60%. So again, connecting with some of the things that Tuan was mentioning before, what this is showing is, of course, mechanically cash transfers, humanitarian assistance are doing a lot in terms of preventing more poverty, but they're not actually creating the conditions for people to become self-reliant. So this is just showing you IDPs are still largely dependent on this type of aid. So what drives this? And back in 2005, when we collected this, it was the first nationally representative survey of displaced populations in Colombia. We started finding that displacement was actually driving a massive loss of assets and capacities. So one, IDPs were losing an incredible amount of lands and productive and physical assets. More than 2.5 million hectares, productive hectares, were being lost or abandoned or seized because of conflict. They were also abandoning their cattle, their chickens, their trucks. Everything was staying behind. There was also the depreciation of human capital. Most of them were coming from the countryside into the cities. They had been working on the agricultural sector, and for men then, their skills were not easily transferred into the cities. And so this kind of just created like massive unemployment among the IDPs. We also started documenting the disruption of social networks, which in context of market failures are essential for being able to smooth consumption, to overcome costly coping strategies. And I think similar to what I think as you shall be that we're talking about coping strategies, we started also finding costly consumption smoothing strategies, taking children out of school, just selling the few assets that they had behind just to make ends meet, right? And this suggests the existence of this asset-based poverty trap that Tuan was mentioning. So from the standard economic perspective, displacement was driving this massive loss of assets, pushing IDPs beyond that critical threshold from which they're not able to recover by themselves. And on the right-hand side, we're showing you the evolution of income and consumption over time for the displaced, and it shows kind of like permanent losses of over 50% on income and over 30% on consumption. So this by itself kind of suggests that programming has to adapt to the understanding of some of these consequences. Humanitarian assistance can do as much, can provide a safety net maybe to prevent further losses, temporal losses, but it cannot break the cycle. Social protection with education, cash transfers, and health can also do as much, But this suggests that we require kind of this big push that I think somebody was mentioning it yesterday. I don't remember who, sorry. It requires this kind of big push, this big asset transfer to bring IDPs from being below that critical asset threshold all the way up. And interestingly enough, there's this recent paper by Arlen Guarín, Juliana Londoño, and Cristian Pozo, taking advantage of all this very detailed administrative data that we have in Colombia. And they started studying the impacts of reparations and indemnities that were around 30, 40 times the minimum wage in Colombia. And so this comes from the National Victims Law. And what they find is sizable impacts on well-being for both adults and children. They don't find impacts on formal earnings, which is kind of surprising, or maybe not. They start finding also impacts on entrepreneurship, investment in physical assets, and positive and sizable impacts on children's education trajectories. And so you see, for instance, for college attendance, the effect of these indemnities and reparations are like 20% effect. So these are big effects percentage-wise. But once you consider that the baseline levels are really small, this goes from like 5% to 8% for college attendance, right? So in relative levels, there's big impacts, but in baseline levels, they're actually not that much. And I think the jury's out in terms of whether this is actually changing the trajectories. And I think Istvan was mentioning that we need kind of more long-run type of evaluations. Do these type of effects actually translate into changing the trajectories, providing this asset base for IDPs to become self-reliant? Now, right when we started collecting this data, we were actually running the pilot for the survey that we started collecting with Ana María Ibáñez. And we ran the pilot in this neighborhood, which is called Altos de Casucas, in the outskirts of Bogotá. It's kind of one of the largest settlements of IDPs in the country. Now it's also a settlement of Venezuelan refugees. We don't have camps. IDPs and refugees kind of just live integrated with host communities. And we were going around this neighborhood, knocking on different doors to try to run and pilot our survey. And I remember very vividly, this person kind of opened the door, said, yeah, I can participate in the survey, but I need to lay down, because she just started to try to communicate that there was something that didn't allow her to just like sit down and talk to us. Immediately we thought, well, we don't want to disturb you. We thought she was physically sick. So we said, we can come back some other day. And she was like, no, I can participate and it would be helpful to talk, but ever since I was displaced, and she just didn't have the words, but we started noticing, well, how naive can we be? Because we're starting to study about consumption, income, social networks, assets, but we kind of miss the most human and more profound effect of displacement and conflict, which is mental health. And this was striking on our way back from the settlement into our houses, like 2-3 hours stuck in traffic. We started thinking, like, how did we miss this? But at the time, nobody was talking about mental health. And over the next few weeks, over the next month, as we were collecting the data, we started thinking, so this seems to be important, but it seems out of our reach as economists. For me, the impact was actually larger, stronger, because it actually made me face mental health, which my dad struggled for most of his life with mental health problems. I, as many other people in the country at that time and right now, just didn't understand this. And I thought it was some type of weakness of character. And I thought my dad's behavior was totally erratic, and it was just like he didn't try enough. But just like facing these realities, it was like total opposite. So it was very emotional and influential for me, because it kind of led me into try to think how mental health, one, is important by itself, and then it can affect all these trajectories. So we know, and Antonia, you gave us some data in terms of mental health. It's a problem in general. Over 11, 12% of the worldwide population suffers with a mental health disorder. These rates are much higher, 2 to 3 times for conflict-affected populations and displaced populations in particular. The figure in your left is actually showing this dose-response relationship, which means here we're plotting the severity of conflict, measured as the number of conflict events, and the mental health of, these are caregivers that we have surveyed in different evaluations. And so we see this kind of very strong dose-response relationship. This was documented for the first time by Richard Moya with actually refugees from Burma, Myanmar in the US. We've been replicating this consistently over time. And it's not a temporal effect. The prevalence of mental health problems exceeds 20% 5 years after displacement. And so why focus on trauma? And why focus on mental health? One, because it's important by itself. It causes profound suffering. It's a fundamental dimension of well-being. Mental health is not only the absence of mental health problems, it also has some of the other dimensions that, Antonia, you were measuring in terms of coping strategies, self-efficacy, and so on. And economists have started recently, for 10, 15 years, to approach on mental health as an economic mechanism. And there's evidence of kind of like a two-way direction between mental health and poverty. Most of this work has been documenting how economic conditions affect mental health. There is some work in terms of how mental health is also affecting economic conditions. And this is not an exhaustive list of different mechanisms through which mental health driven by displacement can affect socioeconomic trajectories and can keep people trapped in poverty. It can affect behavior. For instance, we've documented that it increases risk aversion. It can affect beliefs. It can affect human capital accumulation. There's stigma and discrimination, the same stigma that I was experiencing with my dad as I was growing up. And it can affect early child development. And so I'm going to focus on 3 of these dimensions in the next few slides. So I think, okay. So I had a, how do I go back? Okay. So I had a quote here from this report from Doctors Without Borders. It was interviewing this woman who was displaced from the oriental region of Colombia, and she migrated to Bogotá. And she was kind of very vividly talking about how she was waking up at night, remembering the traumatic experiences. She witnessed a massacre, and she was remembering everything at night. Every night she was having nightmares, that she was repeating the same things. And that she would stay up thinking about, and she, in the quote she says, thinking about her cattle, the animals that she left, her lands, but also thinking about how her life cannot be the same because she's now displaced, right? And so we started thinking, so this seems to connect with hopelessness and this concept about learned helplessness. There's a psychologist, Martin Seligman, who with some other co-authors started to work on learned helplessness. It can be illustrated by this figure. This elephant was probably, when he was small, not able to break this rope and set himself free. And even though he grows up and now has all the strength to be able to rip the rope apart, he just stops trying. And so we started thinking, well, does the nature of displacement, the severity of conflict, the extent of mental health and mental health problems and trauma, does it affect the perspectives and how IDPs start thinking about the future, about their capacity to move on? And so we started thinking, so how do we measure this? There's some psychological scales about hope. They didn't work because although IDPs were reporting to ourselves in conversations that they were basically hopeless, they were also pointing to this external locus of control. Do you hope for a better future? Sure, we need to trust in God, and sure. But their actual behavior was actually going in a different direction. And so we started thinking about this Cantor ladder of life, and came to, this is part of my PhD dissertation. And so we created this ladder of life. We characterized the different steps according to different dimensions: consumption, income, children's education, assets, and so on. And so we told them, well, why don't you put a stone where you were before? being displaced. And so they put it kind of in the middle. Most of them put it in the middle of the ladder. We checked kind of consistency with retrospective data, and this kind of matched the distribution of the position before displacement actually matched the data that they were telling us in terms of assets, consumption, and so on. Then we told them, so where are you right now? And most of them actually put the stone in the bottom of the ladder. And this was consistent, again, with the data that we had on assets, health, and so on, but it was also consistent with the data that we had collected with Ana Maria in terms of how displacement is driving the asset distribution downwards. And then we thought, okay, so how do we ask them about the future? The future is uncertain, and so we just gave them, so there's supposed to be a different slide here. We just gave them 12 stones. And we told them, just like place different stones on the steps of the ladder that you think where you can be in the future. So if you think you're going to be able to go up to the top of the ladder, put more stones there. If you think the country, put more stones in and so on. And what we find is that displacement increases the prospects of staying at the bottom of the ladder. This was driven by the severity of violence and underlying depression and mental health problems. So what we see here is that those that were more affected by conflict had a lower perceived probability of being able to reach the top of the ladder and a higher perceived probability of staying at the bottom. Right? And so this was kind of starting to pick up this perception that they were just kind of, they thought they were unable to move up. Now there's a question. Are these beliefs inaccurate? Are they being overly pessimistic? Or are they recognizing that they also have, on top of the different socioeconomic constraints, they also have a psychological constraint? But here what's important is that, similar to the work that we were doing with Sandra, we're controlling and we're comparing kind of otherwise equal individuals. Same assets right now, same step of the ladder right now, same access to services and so on. But those that were more severely affected by conflict and had higher levels of mental health problems, then were expressing this kind of pessimism and hopelessness. And then we thought, okay, so what is this, how do we think about these beliefs? If we think that they actually are going to map out in socioeconomic trajectories, we can think about a thought experiment and simulating these beliefs and how they're going to map over time. And so in your left panel, we're showing the kind of the evolution of poverty across time for somebody that was displaced but experienced fewer violence. This is the line in black. And somebody that was displaced otherwise similar, but experienced higher levels of conflict. And so what we see is, just in kind of this thought experiment, displacement, mental health problems, and the severity of conflict are actually creating this psychological poverty trap. If the beliefs are accurate, they're going to be affecting the trajectories, and the poverty trap actually, and the poverty rates are actually 2-3 times higher for those who were severely affected. And then we thought, again, connecting with the idea of reparations, what if we give them a big push? What if they're in the first step of the ladder and we give them an asset transfer that puts them in the third step of the ladder? Is this going to be enough to put them at a different trajectory? And so that's kind of the red dotted line below. There's a short-term impact. Poverty rates mechanically go down, but then over time, the psychological constraints pick up, and over time, they reach kind of the same levels of poverty over time, right? And so what this is telling us is that if we don't consider these psychological mechanisms or the loss of psychological capacities and assets, maybe some interventions are going to be ineffective, right? And so there's also work in terms of kind of anti-poverty graduation programs that they work in average, but they don't work for those who have been, who have baseline levels of mental health problems. And I think, Antonia, you were showing like a similar result. Okay. Now, some other evidence here about how mental health problems actually also affect human capital accumulation. Back in 2015, we were getting ready to run an RCT or an impact evaluation of a program that the Colombian government was going to implement. This was a program that was providing standard vocational training with a very light touch module on soft skills. So at that moment, soft skills were kind of on the rise. Angela Duckworth was talking about grit. And so the government said, well, maybe vocational programs don't work because we need to teach the displaced how to manage conflicts, how to control their emotions, how to work in group. So it was very light touch program. We collected all the baseline data, and at the very end, the government pulled out, didn't allow us to continue with the impact evaluation. But we were able to run some associations between baseline mental health problems and skills, program performance, and income trajectories. And what this figure is showing you here, and this is super exciting because in Copenhagen, in the first conference, I presented this at a poster session. What we're seeing is these patterns of association between mental health problems, this is PTSD, and lower levels of self-esteem, lower levels of self-control, lower levels of perseverance, fluid intelligence, empathy, and a higher level of an external locus of control. Again, thinking, I'm unable to control what's going to happen with me. Maybe I put everything on God, but basically I'm just unable. Again, I'm hopeless. We also connected this with admin data from the program. Those who had mental health problems at baseline were also less likely to attend the courses. They were less likely to graduate. And over time, we connected this with admin data from the Colombian government, and we were seeing like negative impacts across negative associations with formal employment and labor income 24 months after the program ended. Now, this is, Nawa Ashraf has, I think, there's, yes, sorry, this is not the latest version of the slides, but Nawa Ashraf has this impact evaluation. I think it's coming QJE, right? IPA was involved in the impact evaluation. She was running this entrepreneurship program, and on top of that, they implemented this mentalizing intervention, trying to help IDPs see a better future. And what they find for Ethiopia, more strongly, but also for Colombia, is that the traditional training reduces the quality of mental experiencing, but that working on visualization, trying to help IDPs to think about a better future, actually seems to be breaking a little bit of the cycle. And some other work that we conducted with Elena Esposito and Rafael Laliv, right in the pandemic, we were running this impact evaluation of a standard vocational training program. And on top of that, we had an arm in which we provided some psychosocial support. This was much more intensive than the one that you evaluated, Antonia. And here, what we see is actually at the peak of the pandemic, Colombia went into a very strict lockdown. Receiving vocational training was actually reducing the extent of depression. But actually, for those of them who were having the bundled intervention, they were having even lower levels. At the end, everybody converged to the same levels, but at least this evidence is showing that this evidence, and the one from Nawa Ashraf, is showing that actually combining different type of interventions, similar to Antonia, providing kind of traditional socioeconomic interventions, along with mental health support, can actually start breaking a little bit of the cycle. Okay? So, what about early child development? And a different anecdote here, and kind of in a similar spirit to what happened when we started thinking about mental health. This is me. I was in my PhD, a little bit more hair. And I went to the field for 10 months collecting data from field experiments. So this is where I got the hopelessness data from. I was also collecting data on risk aversion, time preferences. And this was actually the first experiment that I ran in this municipality, Tierra Alta, that had been affected by severe paramilitary violence. And so I was using ping pong balls to try to elicit the probabilities for risk aversion experiments, for the hopelessness experiment. And I asked the communities not to bring their children to the experiments. I was just like very focused on my dissertation. But obviously this didn't happen. And this woman came with her child. And so I thought, well, why don't you play with this ping pong in the corner so I can run my experiment? Obviously, she was running all over. She was sitting there talking to me, looking at the slides, going back to her mom. And then all of a sudden, her mom just takes her, yells at her, shakes her, sits her down, and slaps her. And I was surprised by this, but also by the fact that nobody reacted. Totally normalized. And again, I think I have to say here that I was completely naive and condescended. I had to turn around and I kind of thought to myself, well, this is wrong. This is not the right way to treat your child. I didn't have a child at the time, but it seemed just like totally wrong. And we know that physical violence has very negative effects on child development and on the long-term trajectories. And so I started thinking, so what's happening with this child? So they experience displacement, they're in poverty, and on top of that, she's receiving all this physical, verbal, and sometimes sexual violence. But then over time, as I spent 10 months in the field, and noticing that this was, one, totally prevalent, and two, totally normalized, came again to this realization that I was, again, being totally naive. I was coming in to run some experiments about the concavity of the utility function to measure risk aversion, about these weird constructs of that we as economists think about. And I was missing, maybe, the more natural, and I was thinking about mental health, but I was missing maybe the most natural response of caregivers in these type of environments. How does a caregiver manage to overcome her trauma, displacement, exclusion, discrimination, and at the same time be able to connect with her children in a sensitive way? And this connects with the results that Sandra was mentioning. This is just going to go taking away the Venezuelan refugees from the sample and the data that Sandra was mentioning. This is again highlighting the intergenerational transmission of poverty and trauma, the effects for displaced children, whether they experience displacement by themselves or whether they were born to a displaced household, especially in terms of social-emotional development, anxiety, depression, and trauma. So how come? What are the mechanisms behind this? And Sandra was telling us already, it's not wealth. It's not that displacement drives people into wealth, into poverty, and then poverty is associated with strong socioeconomic gradients and human capital accumulation. That's part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. So let's dig a little bit deeper in terms of the science of early child development. So we know that early childhood from 0 to 5, 6 years of age is the most important, it's the most magical moment of our lives. It's the moment where there is like rapid brain plasticity, 1 million neuronal connections per second. So in the figure on your right, you're seeing what's called the brain architecture, the connections between different neurons. These are called synapses. And what you see is that there's rapid brain development. By 9 months, most of the brain is developed. By 2 years, all the brain is developed. And then over time, there's a process that's called pruning, in which the neural connections that are like a little bit weaker, not properly used, start fading out. So we know that this period of life is foundational for well-being, for life trajectories, but also for the future of our societies. It's going to affect health, both physical and mental. It's going to affect skill acquisition. It affects socioeconomic trajectories. And the nurture and care framework tells us that to thrive, for children to be able to lead healthy, happy, successful lives, they need kind of 4 core ingredients. One is adequate nutrition and good health. So we were just seeing the paper from Turkey on health, opportunity for early learning, but especially safety and security and sensitive caregiving. The capacity of a caregiver to be able to recognize the emotions, to connect, to respond to those emotions. And the reason is that the brain is not totally developed during early childhood. The parts of the brain that are actually involved in emotional regulation are not developed. And so children need the relationship with a caregiver to be able to regulate their emotions. When a caregiver is not there, it's not emotionally available, and when children are experiencing severe persistent adversities, stress starts picking up and picking up and picking up and becomes toxic. And so what you see in the figure on your right is, on the top panel, the fMRI scan of the hippocampus, which is involved actually in emotional regulation, for a child that has been exposed to normal circumstances, the one below to a child that has been exposed to toxic stress. And what you can see is that the density of the brain architecture is disrupted, but also that there's damaged neural connections. And these are, in some sense, wounds that may last for a very, very long time and that can be persistent. And they are somewhat invisible, but are going to affect the life trajectories of these children. So they affect brain architecture, they affect skill acquisition, they affect physical and mental health, and they have life-altering effects. So again, the capacity of a caregiver to be able to connect with their children in a sensitive way is essential, because it's going to allow these children to regulate the stress, and toxic stress becomes tolerable stress. And actually, among a very broad literature on parenting interventions, early child development interventions, the most impactful factor is actually the capacity of a caregiver to connect with their child in this sensitive way. So it seems that the solution is there. Well, we need to teach caregivers to connect. But again, how do they do this? How does this women do to be able to overcome trauma, displacement, poverty, exclusion, the stress of not being able to feed their family, and connect at the same time with their children? And we know that trauma hinders this capacity to provide sensitive care. The interactions and the type of relationships of a caregiver who is experiencing mental health problems become dysregulated. They become emotionally disengaged. They're less able to identify the emotions of the child. They're less able to respond to these emotions. And they seem to be bringing all the adversity that's happening outside of family into the family. And this is precisely the mechanism behind some of the results that Sandra was mentioning. This is kind of one of the mechanisms behind the transmission of poverty and trauma across generations. And I can show you this with some of the data that we have collected over different impact evaluations. So here I'm plotting on the red line the distributions of the quality of the relationship, the type of interactions, children's mental health, children's development, for caregivers who have mental health problems at baseline. The black dashed line is for those who have been displaced but are not at risk. And so you can see very clearly that trauma, mental health problems, are actually affecting all these dimensions. They're affecting the quality of the relationship, the type of interaction, and then this translates and maps out into children's mental health and early child development. And so in different impact evaluations that we run, we've understood that trauma actually explains between 50 to 80% of the effect of conflict on children and the effect of conflict and displacement in children. Again, similar to what Sandra was mentioning, the children don't have to experience displacement by themselves to kind of receive this legacy of poverty and trauma. And then there's also recent evidence that's showing that also conflict is affecting epigenetic signatures, like the type of genes that are being activated or not, and this also explains this transmission across time. Unfortunately, as it happens in, like, with the broader anti-poverty literature, standard parenting programs have addressed a different type of constraint, more like cognitive constraints, teaching caregivers on why it's important to provide sensitive care, how they can do this in their everyday lives. There's been very successful programs here. One of them is the Jamaica home visiting program that has been implemented in many places, including in Southeast Asia. But similar to the results that Antonio was mentioning, these programs actually have no effects when the caregiver has a mental health problem. So when the caregiver has a mental health problem, the constraint is not cognitive, it's not information, it's much more profound, it's psychological. And unfortunately, many of these studies, like most of this literature on ECD impact evaluation, has largely ignored mental health. And in programming and in funding, mental health interventions have also been receiving like a tiny, tiny, tiny amount and fraction of resources. So I can see from your faces, and I can also feel it, this seems to be pretty kind of like depressing and hopeless, right? So I don't want to end with that type of note. I want to show you that carefully designed interventions can actually help us break the cycle. And I'm going to be talking about this program that we developed back in 2014, which is called Semillas de Apego. It translates as seeds for attachment. So the seeds for healthy attachment, and the idea is that we can promote a healthier attachment relationship. This is going to translate into more sensitive care, and then this is going to like change the opportunities and trajectories for these children. So it's a community-based model. It's led by non-professional community facilitators, most of them who have been experiencing conflict themselves, displacement, sexual violence, and who we train and support throughout the program's implementation. It's group-based. It's between like, groups of 15 to 20 caregivers. And it's directed to caregivers of young children and these conflict-affected displaced communities in Colombia. So, Antonio, you were mentioning about the like breathing exercises in your model. So this is similar. And it has two broad objectives. One, restore caregiver mental health as an objective by itself, but also as the pathway to promote more sensitive care, which then should, in theory, lead us to improved child development over time. And so all the sessions, and so it happens over 15 weeks. There's one session per week that lasts approximately 2.5 hours. And then we work with these caregivers over time, 15 weeks. Most of the sessions, like all the sessions, follow the similar structure. At the beginning, there's kind of like activity on emotional awareness and regulation. The ideas for these caregivers, again, in a setting of extreme stigma, where we hide all mental health problems behind the rug or the table, to try to connect with their buddies, to start understanding the physical manifestations of trauma, to start recognizing how mental health is affecting different ways in our body and then in our emotions, and then to start thinking about different strategies for emotional regulation, as the one that I was showing you here, with some pranayama breathing exercise. Then it goes into the main activity, which is a reflective practice. This program has a reflective component. It's not psychoeducation. We don't come to teach the caregivers about what they should be doing, but it's more about reflecting on their life experiences, on how mental health is affecting them, how it's affecting their relationship with their children and with others. And by the end of the program, and usually this main activity is actually grounded in some elements of art therapy, as you're seeing here. So the caregivers go and start working in their like little arts and crafts, and then by the end, they get together and they start discussing about what they reflected, what they learned, what they're experiencing. And there's different elements here that I would like to highlight in terms of the community and group-based approach. At the beginning, we started implementing this program in a massively underserved setting in Colombia. I'll show you a little bit later. And so we couldn't find psychologists to be able to deliver the program. And so we thought, well, let's work as in task-shifting models. Let's work with community facilitators because it's going to be feasible. But then over time, we started realizing that it was more than feasibility, because then the community members can start overcoming stigma and start becoming aware of the manifestations of mental health, the impacts of conflict, because they start recognizing themselves in the experiences of the facilitators or the teachers, as they mentioned to them. So they start realizing somebody else in this room in my community is going through the same type of experiences. There's nothing wrong in me, as I previously may have thought. This is normal. And I start seeing this not only in the community facilitator, also in the group. So we can start then overcoming this strong barrier in terms of stigma. It promotes self-efficacy because I can also start connecting and identifying myself with the experience of this facilitator who went through all of this and now is kind of changing the way in which she relate with their children and with others. And it also fosters this type of collective agency. We were talking yesterday about networks and how difficult is it to build these networks. And so these networks start kind of, we're breaking also the effects of conflict on social trust, capacity to cooperate, and these networks can actually support the caregivers throughout the process. And so we've been running different process and impact evaluations over time. Back in 2018, as the peace process kind of was unraveling in Colombia, we went to Tumaco. Tumaco is in the southwest border of Colombia. It's a region that's magnificent, geographically rich, culturally incredible. People are incredible, mostly Afro-Colombians. The food is not as good as here, but it's really good. You're coming in the plane, and there's like, it's the jungle and many rivers coming into Pacific Ocean. But that blessing is also cursed because 70% of the drug trade in Colombia comes through all these rivers into the Pacific coast. And so it's a municipality that has been severely affected and controlled by different armed groups. So back when we started this impact evaluation, homicide rates were like 4 times above, almost 3 times above the national average. Displacement rates were also like 4 times higher. There was massive poverty, 45% in Tumaco versus 20% in Colombia. And we had to deal with the complexities and challenges of running an impact evaluation in a setting of ongoing conflict. The map in your right is showing you the dots are the childcare centers that we partner with to be able to come into communities and identify the potential participants, run the program, and so on. And the red kind of clouds are showing you the areas of influence of control of different armed groups. Actually, violence was actually much more visible in the other places because these were regions that, neighborhoods that were contested. And so we targeted almost 1,400 caregivers of young children in these 18 childcare centers. 96% of them were women, although the program is not directed towards women per se, because of different cultural norms, socioeconomic conditions. Our participants are usually women. Most of them are mothers, but we have grandmothers, aunts, and so on. And without targeting the program, 57% of our sample had been displaced. 82% of them had been at least exposed directly to one violent event. And 40% of them were experiencing severe mental health problems. And within the setting, we conducted an evaluation. We assigned the program randomly across the different clusters, the childcare centers, and we collected data 1 month after the program ended and 8 months after the program ended. And what you can see here is that the effects pick up over time. And we create sizable impacts on caregiver mental health of around 0.18 standard deviation. What does that mean? For instance, a reduction in 35% in the extent of phobic anxiety, so a specific type of anxiety disorder that's closely tied to the consequences of displacement. We see sizable improvements in the quality of the relationship, so the ability of the caregiver to be able to connect with their children. We see sizable, kind of less strong impacts on interactions, the type of activities that caregivers start running with their children. And we see impacts on children's mental health and child development. And when we run some mediation analysis, we showed that a large portion of what's happening with child development and the quality is actually being driven by caregiver mental health. So this is telling us, so the science of early child development was telling us sensitive care is important. Trauma is affecting the capacity to provide sensitive care. If we address this psychological constraint, then things will follow, and that's exactly what we start finding. And to be honest, I thought when we designed this program and when we ran this impact evaluation that was it for me, that we should move to a different direction, that we should hand this over to an NGO. But then we started kind of thinking about different questions about scaling, about impact on different populations, for instance, Venezuelan refugees that were starting to come en masse to Colombia. And also thinking that maybe we handed this to some other organization that we're going to cut a little bit corners, and we wanted to preserve kind of the nature and the magic behind the program. And so from this impact evaluation and implementation in Tumaco, in which we reached 350 caregivers per year with a team of 6 community facilitators. Then we went to almost a 12-fold increase in the number of municipalities from 1 to 12. 4,200 caregivers per year, a team of 72 community facilitators. And this scale, most of our facilitators are former participants. So women who came into our program, and then over time we were able to train them, support them, and now they lead the program implementation. And in terms of the research, this kind of creates different questions, specifically on what's called the scale-up effect, where John Les has been talking about the voltage effect. And there's evidence that kind of carefully designed impact evaluations at small scale, when you scale them, they lose impact. And some of the reasons is, one is external validity. So now we designed the program for IDPs, but now we're reaching kind of like a broader set of the population, Venezuelan refugees, for instance, who may or may not be experiencing the same type of constraints. We're also kind of like reaching host communities. So will the program work appropriately for these different type of communities? And then with a team of community facilitators, we also have to think, how do we preserve quality, fidelity? How do we support them? How do we train them? How do we supervise? And how do we implement monitoring systems that are going to tell us data over time in terms of what's happening with the program to be able to start fixing things here and there? And so we're conducting two evaluations right now. The first one is in processes, following implementation science frameworks. And what we're showing here, this is very preliminary results that actually got Saturday on Thursday. One is in terms of processes. We're finding, for instance, that the dosage, the average number of sessions that caregivers in the program actually attend to, is very similar when we had the small scale and when we had the large scale. A lot of people actually drop out, like a little bit under 10% drop out in the first session. Maybe they come in and this is not fulfilling their expectations. But the majority of the participants that come into the program actually stay for 13, 14, 15 sessions. And this happened in the small scale evaluation where we were on top of everything. And now as we're starting to scale. And in the most recent, I got this Thursday night. This is the impact evaluation has been supported in part by the HPI initiative from JPAL. We have preliminary evidence of what's happening at the short run. So one, positive, moderate improvements in caregiver mental health. And we started testing mechanisms, something that we hadn't done in the previous impact evaluation. So we started thinking, so how is the program affecting stigma? Here, I think as Andreas did in his presentation, we're normalizing everything. Positive means better. So we're addressing stigma. Participants now are more willing to engage about mental health conversations. They feel less ashamed about discussing their own mental health. They start also experiencing an improvement in their emotional regulation. And importantly, again, connecting with networks, they start perceiving that they belong to a community. So it's not only about individual agency, it's about collective agency. And we're seeing that these three dimensions in the bottom part of the figure are actually driving or partly explaining what's happening in terms of mental health. The following follow-up is happening in July, right after the World Cup and right after the Colombian elections. And we should be having results pretty soon in terms of whether we maintain impact at scale. But then let me finish. As we were designing this impact evaluation, we thought, well, previously we had seen that displacement and mental health problems were creating this sense of hopelessness. Let's try to run the ladder of life again in this new impact evaluation. And again, we see kind of very consistent results in terms of displacement. Mental health problems actually lower the prospects of being at the top of the ladder, increase the prospects of being at the bottom of the ladder. So again, this experience of kind of hopelessness. So does the treatment try to kind of break the cycle? Does it overcome these psychological constraints? And what we're seeing is that there's positive impacts of the treatment and the perceptions of moving to the top of the ladder. And that actually lowers the perceived probability of being at the bottom of the ladder. The impacts are not yet sizable enough to be able to overcome the effects of displacement and trauma, but it seems promising in terms of that this intervention that was not designed to break the cycle is also having this kind of positive spillovers into other dimensions. So let me conclude and stop there. I have 7 minutes. One is, I think, and this is not only from my presentation, but I think from like picking up a lot of what has been discussed here, but even in previous JDC conferences, there's a high extent of chronic poverty among the displaced. This can be actually explained by the erosion of physical, human, social, but also psychological capacities. Mental health, unfortunately, has been systematically ignored in many contexts and for many partners in the humanitarian setting, working with IDPs, working with refugees, something that's considered as a luxury. But I've been showing you some data and some evidence that shows that actually it can contribute to persistence of poverty through different mechanisms, affecting beliefs, affecting behavior, directly affecting skill acquisition, human capital accumulation. It's affecting the trajectories of the next generation. And what we've shown here, and that's actually closely related to the literature on anti-poverty programs, that tackling these two constraints together, mental health with carefully designed interventions, along with standard economic interventions, may create the capacities or the opportunities for the displaced to move beyond like that asset-based poverty trap that Tuan was mentioning. Now, as we're talking about self-reliance, it also seems important to conclude highlighting, so sure, these interventions can do so much for the displaced, but we also need to think about more structural transformation. We need to think about labor market interventions. We need to think about growth. We need to think about development. We can equip IDPs or refugees in general with different capacities, but again, as we were seeing yesterday, if they're unable to leave the camp, if unemployment rates are soaring, if there's no opportunity to take their skills, are not going to be able to become in some way productive. And a couple of questions in terms of mental health. One is measurements. If we don't measure mental health, it doesn't exist. But then measuring mental health in humanitarian settings and displaced communities is very difficult. Researchers usually come in with standardized scales, PHQ-9, GAD, as Antonia was using. Sometimes they're not contextually valid. Sometimes they also miss important dimensions of mental health that are affected by conflict. It's not only about anxiety and depression. It's not only about PTSD. Sometimes it's about complex trauma. And deploying these scales at scale is very difficult and very challenging. And so it's important also to think about developing low-cost, scalable, and contextually appropriate measures and screening tools for mental health. And if you're interested in this, Tuan is leading this very innovative and ambitious initiative for voice biomarkers, we can mention this, with implementation in different countries, including Colombia. And the other one is in terms of programming. So one is WHO, UNHCR have been promoting task shifting models as community facilitators, for instance. They seem to be promising a scale, but there's a lot of questions here, as I was mentioning, in terms of fidelity, in terms of quality. How do we ensure the basic packages, training, support, monitoring, to be able to implement these programs at scale? And there's recent interest in digital delivery. Seems to be very promising, seems to be able to provide us huge scale at very low cost. But there's like very, very, very profound open questions about take-up, who's taking up the program, whether people stay in, the ethics, data protection, and I think connecting with the discussion on why the community mental health program works, also whether digital interventions are actually ignoring the social connection, collective agency that seems to be very important to break the cycle. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. So Tuan is there, but we can take some. You have the.
Now the audience is so informal. We seem to be so much in a close setting, so I thought the conversation would be going. But let me take a few questions. I think microphones are going to circulate. Please introduce yourself quickly so that we get some context. And go ahead. There's one question here and one here.
Yeah.
And one here too.
Maybe I'll, sorry, go ahead. Thank you. Debulina here from IFPRI. Really fascinating presentation, both very sobering but also inspiring at the same time. Sparked a lot of ideas, but I'll try to keep it focused on one specific thread. In the sort of violence prevention world and literature coming from SVRI and other sources, there's a lot of established relationships between sort of violence against children overlapping with violence against women, in the same sort of households. Often caregivers who experience intimate partner violence or violence from their spouses and partners and so on, also happen to perpetuate that against children and so on. So I was just curious if, also in terms of just, you mentioned seeing positive impacts on sort of relationship quality between caregiver and child. I'd be curious if there's also positive relationship sort of improvements between caregiver and partners, for instance. And maybe this is just from my personal interest in sort of having worked in male engagement in sort of caregiving and violence prevention, but just curious if there's any plans of either including measurement on these sort of gendered aspects or including partners in future programming. Yeah.
Second question, I think, yes. Please.
Hi, I'm Widya from Jesuit Refugee Service. I would like to ask you, because it's very interesting, we're working with refugees in the camps and also in the urban context. And there is no single factor that actually that affects their lives and eventually bring them into I would say, mental breakdown. And recently we found more cases of suicide attempts and also suicide ideation in the urban and also in the camps. What I'm trying to ask you is, do you have any formula of different interventions that will lead into better mental well-being for the children, especially in young adults, in the context of refugees and IDPs? Thank you.
So we'll take two more, I think.
Okay, hello. My name is Tammy Sharp. I am with UNHCR Thailand. I wanted to ask, and I hope I didn't get it wrong, because you were using the term reparations. And I wanted to understand how you were using that term, because I was understanding it more as in reference to cash-based assistance and not in terms of a transitional justice term on that one, which then you had me really kind of thinking and spinning as to what might be the value of trying to even look at some of the reparations issues within that in the mental health issues. Thank you.
And last one, Aisha. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andrés, for accepting to come here in a very, very compelling keynote. When you were referencing the World Cup, I was thinking you were going to do an additional shout out to our dear friend here about, Italy and whatnot. So, but you didn't go in so far, right? So, but thank you so very much. But, on a more serious note, I was particularly struck by how you connected the rigorous evidence with your lived experience, no? So, and then remind us that behind, we've heard throughout this conference with the panelists, that behind these dynamics are deeply human realities, no? So that our policy often fail to fully capture. And then when I was listening to you, your work make a compelling case that mental health is central constraint to economic, mobility among displaced population. And since the JDC have been just working towards bridging this gap between research and policy, and then Tuan impressed again on it this morning, if I was like a government, counterpart, and I wanted to fully integrate this insight into the self-reliance, which is one of the top agenda across our two parent institutions, what would be the single most transformative policy or investment you would prioritize to break the cycle? Not just break it, but at scale. Thank you.
So Andrés, there are two questions on kind of the limits, whether it's about GBV or about young people, and then there's the ones on policy and instruments. So whatever order you want to proceed.
Great, thank you so much. So, Dorina, we were actually talking, I think, with Murat before about gender-based violence, and so this is something that we didn't incorporate explicitly in the program, but then over time we started picking up that it was not only displacement and conflict-related violence to displacement, but there was also like a large extent of violence against women, both from when they were children and right now. And this starts coming up and coming up and coming up in the group sessions. And so now it's kind of incorporated that it's just like a multiplicity of adversities. We don't know and we don't have the data. And I think hopefully in the near future we can run like at least like a type of network analysis and how these findings are maybe affecting also the dynamics within the family. We have some anecdotal evidence that is kind of suggesting that this is also kind of creating empowerment within the family. And then I think it connects with the question on suicidal ideation, adolescence. I think there's just like a multiplicity of risks that are compounding on the displaced. And for adolescents, it's been super hard to engage with them. Not in this program, because this program is for a different type of age group, but at a different program that we were working with Boston College and Teresa Betancourt, trying to bring one of her like flagship programs into Colombia. Very difficult to engage with adolescents, just like a perceived like hopelessness and lack of willingness to engage in mental health, mostly for men. Women were a little bit more willing, but this kind of relates to the study of Sandra. It's just like the persistence of multiplicity of risks and over time. And so when you reach adolescence, it's kind of very hard to move the needle. From the ECD space, we know that you need to start implementing before. In terms of reparations, it's a great question. So it's not cash transfers. So the government with the victims law established reparations like as indemnities, and they try to do this in two ways. One, land restitution, and so giving the displaced the opportunity to go back to their lands and giving them land titles. Many of them don't pick this up. Many of them prefer to stay in the cities, and so they receive like a large sum, 30 to 40 times the minimum wage, as a type of indemnity called reparation. So, but then again, we don't know how that is kind of it's affecting in the short term. We don't know how that is affecting in the long run. And then I think that's the key question. Yeah, you put me in a bad spot. But let me go in a different direction, Maya. You had talked about whether in the previous session, you had a comment on whether all these policies, but also the labeling, victims, and you see victims the whole time, victims, unidad de víctimas, registro único de víctimas, all these things, how that is actually contributing to you feeling that you're a victim and you're not being able to overcome your victimhood over time. And so whether there's a psychological message there that's also contributing to the persistence, it may be, and I think it's also useful to start thinking about this. But yeah, so I think we need to, so I say like a big part of my message is we need to pay attention to mental health. This doesn't mean that we should give our backs into all the other type of interventions. I think the evidence, both from Semillas, but especially the Nava Ashra program and the one we ran in the pandemic, is showing that complementaries, similar to Antonia's presentation here, complementaries can be important. And obviously, this means it's difficult to scale. It's much more expensive in the short run, but it can be much more cost effective. And I think the main message that we also need, there's kind of like a balance in terms of scaling, but doing this right for some of these victims or IDPs, the severity of trauma, the multiplicity of risks requires thorough interventions and not light touch interventions. So thank you again.
We might take a last round of questions if there are some remaining. Let's take two, and I have one as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think psychosocial support is very important, and mental health support is very important. And also, my question is, what steps can we take to change the mindset of displaced communities to be active into economic development, entrepreneurship, help themselves? You know, IDPs or displaced communities have been supported for many years, and they have been depending on humanitarian aid. How can we change their mindset to become a normal citizen? It's very important. I think you talked about the hope, and also IDPs should think the way that they can be removed from these IDP settlements to the citizen. I think that's very important. Thank you.
Caroline?
Hi, Caroline from IPA. My question is about a lot of the interventions that you talked about today happen after people have arrived somewhere safe, or relatively safe. And so how should we think about these in settings where people are not yet safe or where it's more acute conflict settings, and how do we support children and their caregivers there?
And so my question is more on the technical front. If we look at how, let's say, budget support improve mental health, we have one elasticity. If you have how mental health affects ability to raise income, you have another elasticity. And the poverty trap is easy to identify. It's when those two elasticities multiply, the multiplication of those two is greater than one, we have a poverty trap. So the question is, how far are we to being able to answer that question?
Okay, great question. So let me start, Caroline. So most of this work is happening in settings that are not entirely safe. So the picture that I show you when we encounter mental health, it's very dangerous because setting, it's in the slums, controlled also by different groups. And so the displaced are fleeing from conflict, but then they reach urban violence. The impact evaluation, the first impact evaluation of Semillas de Apego en Tumaco was the setting of active conflict. And so I think in general, we haven't been able to test this in settings of more stability. And so that's why, for instance, I was talking that we need to measure other things, not only anxiety, depression, PTSD. PTSD, it's trauma still happening, so we need to think about complex trauma and so on. But I think the findings are telling you that even in these settings, you're able to provide skills for emotional awareness, regulation, to be able to overcome what's happening outside. And maybe that connects with your question in terms of, I think the mindset is actually, I think we need to take a step back and recognize that this mindset is endogenous. It's actually a product of all the multiple risks that IDPs and refugees are experiencing. And I think once we realize that, it's not, again, as I approach many discussions with my dad, it's not a failure of character. It's actually a result of their life histories. And then one initial strategy is trying to put mental health on the table and trying to be able to talk about this in a different way, without stigma, with more empathy, and maybe that's it's gonna start moving the needle. And I think your question is super important and very difficult to answer. I would only say that you probably know this, the Dean Carlin and Chris Udry paper, critiquing the Oriana Bandera paper, empirically, so conceptually, we think the poverty traps, and there's many reasons why the poverty traps, we believe they exist. Empirically, is very difficult to identify. I tried this during the dissertation for the psychosocial component in parallel to the socioeconomic dimensions. I think it's an empirical question that we don't yet have the tools or the data to be able to test this. I think maybe connecting with one of your comments. We need more research, and we need more research over time to be able to see if we're actually changing those trajectories. And that would be kind of a signal that kind of we're pushing people above the poverty trap. Thank you again.
So we are passing now on the closing sessions and inviting Aisha. I don't see it. Tamni and, sorry, I cannot read on the screen.